What's going on, everyone? If you weren't aware, it's currently election season here in Canada, and taking some inspiration from Karsten Rundquist's video on the favorite films of American presidents, I thought it would be a fun challenge to watch the favorite movies of Canadian prime ministers. Unfortunately, the personal media preferences of our politicians up north are severely underdocumented compared to their American counterparts. There's no real Canadian equivalent to screening a movie in the White House, so I was really forced to stretch the definition of favorite for some of these. I tried my best to narrow it down to at least confirmed viewings that we can say that the Prime Minister actually watched this movie, but please don't take most of this for solid historical fact. Of course, unfortunately, we have to skip the first few Prime Ministers, as cinema did not come to Canada until just before the turn of the 20th century, and, well, as you'll soon see, this challenge was hard enough to complete as it is.
Took a trip out west, when the Saskatoon.
Out of the gate, we're going to get a couple movies out of the way that have been lost to time, where no surviving copy exists to view. Wilfrid Laurier was the first French-Canadian Prime Minister and was purportedly pretty into the arts, as he was labeled a major patron of the arts by Library and Archives Canada. While there's obviously not a ton of evidence that he really watched that many movies, according to this book, it is understood that due to a reference to the titular character he made in one of his speeches, he may have just seen the 20-minute The Battle of the Long Sault or Dollard des Ormeaux. I told you I was reaching. This film depicts an Iroquois invasion of French settlers and the colonists' defense led by Dollard. No copy of the film exists today, and all we have to go on are a couple of favorable reviews and the possible reference by Laurier a year later. But hey, it's a start. Another film almost entirely lost to time, Cameron of the Royal Mounted, is the story of a Scottish immigrant who falls in love, gets shot, and becomes an RCMP officer. The then former Prime Minister, Robert Borden, is confirmed to have attended the premiere on February 10th, 1922, and while we're not sure whether he even really liked it, it is at the very least a film that he is confirmed to have watched, which is more than I can say for myself. If anyone at Library and Archives Canada wants to hit me up with the surviving reels, please do leave a comment. Okay, we're finally on to a movie that we can finally watch. The ninth Prime Minister, Arthur Meighen, was a huge fan of Shakespeare, and I am sure he would have loved some of our modern interpretations. But while he was alive, he and fellow Prime Minister R.B. Bennett were investors in Canadian International, a film production company whose 1928 effort, Carry On Sergeant, was meant to combat the encroachment of American films in Canadian culture, which is a tale as old as time. It failed miserably to compensate for its $500,000 budget, which at the time was the most expensive production in Canadian history. The Canadian film industry struggled to recover until the 60s and 70s, but this can hardly be a reflection on the film's quality. It follows a factory worker who volunteers for World War I and rises through the ranks of the Canadian military due to his bravery, despite constantly missing his wife back home. The film is essentially a summary of the entire conflict, and as such it feels pretty bloated as we move through most of the major beats of the European front. The $500,000 isn't wasted per se. The set design and camera work is really impressive, especially for the time, but because the filmmakers try to fit so much in, it's pretty hard to stay invested for long portions. It switches rapidly between, some slapstick war antics from the comic relief character, and you go, okay, I guess this is a pretty funny war comedy. And then the main character is trying to resist having an affair while missing his wife. And then on top of all that, there's kind of a random side plot where an almost entirely separate group of characters is chasing down a German spy in Paris. Overall, the film definitely tries to take on too much, and it's not wholly surprising that Carry On Sergeant heralded a stunting of the entire Canadian film industry. I do think it's an interesting piece of history, but I suppose it might be a stretch to call it the favorite of any Prime Minister, much less two. In Ottawa in 1983, Pierre saw the Canadian premiere of the conclusion to George Lucas's original Star Wars trilogy. With him was son Justin, who said that it was the best installment yet.
It was better than The Empire Strikes Back and Star Wars. At least I think so.
We'll come back to Justin's take later, but for now, I like the idea that Pierre, the loving father, would go along with this opinion of whatever his son likes most. Return of the Jedi sees the Rebel Alliance, led by our favorite trio, mount a final charge on the mighty Empire, where the Emperor and Darth Vader seek to turn Luke to the dark side. In my opinion, I think it is the weakest of the original three Star Wars, in that it doesn't look or move as well as its predecessors, particularly for the first two-thirds, as everything seems pretty meandering and small in scope. Once that final act actually kicks into gear though, it's worth the price of admission, and the payoff is well earned as father and son come together to win. I think maybe you could guess where I'm headed with my prime ministerial analysis of this, but we'll have to wait for Justin's favorite film to dive in fully. For now, I'll just say that I can certainly see Pierre enjoying his time in the movies with his son. He must have been really confused when Hayden Christensen showed up on screen, though. Though he wasn't even prime minister for a full year, Joe Clark's legacy would be defined by essentially one incident, the Canadian caper that would form the basis of Ben Affleck's Argo. At the premiere of this documentary covering the true story, Joe Clark stated that he preferred the documentary to Affleck's version, so at the very least he liked it more than at least one other movie. The documentary centers around Ken Taylor, the Canadian ambassador who oversaw the rescue of 6 American hostages who pretended to be filmmakers doing location scouting. The story is obviously pretty compelling, but the documentary is pretty run-of-the-mill. Joe Clark does a talking head himself, which is neat, and it definitely shows that he might be a bit biased, but there's nothing really separating the film from any other talking head / archival footage documentary you'd see in history class.
Black diamonds on silk, milk and gold keys. Boot boogie party tracks, Cadillac ease. Ladies lean back, baby tees, cut jeans. The city of love, feel free.
Though he was close friends with actor-turned-American President Ronald Reagan, I couldn't find any evidence that Canada's 18th Prime Minister ever actually watched anything his buddy starred in. However, in one article, it is mentioned that he was familiar with the show Perry Mason from the 60s, so I went ahead and watched the first TV movie of the 80s reboot, which has the same lead actor, and might just have entertained Mr. Mulroney as much as it had 20 years earlier. Perry Mason Returns is a 1985 made-for-TV movie set about 20 years after the conclusion of the original series. Perry Mason, a star defense lawyer, comes back to the job to defend his former secretary, who's being framed for the murder of a wealthy businessman. As I haven't seen any other Perry Mason stuff, I was a little lost here at times when it referenced things that were relevant to the original series, but as the plot went on, it was pretty hard to fault entirely, as it became the classic rich guy writes his kids out of the will, then gets murdered, and all the snotty kids are suspects plot. It's a little dated and nothing special from a filmmaking perspective, but it kept me relatively entertained, and I can certainly see Mulroney enjoying the reboot of a loved series after leaving his post as Prime Minister. Canada's first and only female Prime Minister to date, Campbell was also not long for the job like Joe Clark, but as Consul General to Los Angeles, she was asked about the Oscar controversy of the song Blame Canada. She is on record as not being offended, which means she must have watched at least some of it, right? That's good enough for this video. South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut is about a group of kids who come back from a screening of a Canadian movie having learned all kinds of vulgar language from it, and their distraught parents end up waging a war on Canada and Canadian culture. It's an absurd and offensive musical animated comedy that, for one, depicts Satan in an abusive and erotic relationship with Saddam Hussein. Not much more needs to be said, other than I did admittedly enjoy it, despite never really being a South Park guy. Those songs were honestly pretty great, and I was amused for most of the runtime, which is as much as you can say for any animated comedy. Jean Chrétien appeared to enjoy meeting with celebrities, and in one such case, dressed up with Dan Aykroyd in character. That is plenty good enough for me, and plenty good enough for this video, and I appreciate that it shows his fandom. If you're not familiar with The Blues Brothers, it's a movie based on SNL characters that Aykroyd and Jim Belushi came up with, two brothers who have a touring band. In a film full of cameos from soul music legends, we follow the brothers as they evade Nazis, the police, and a murderous ex, all the while playing shows to raise money for the orphanage where they were brought up. I know a lot of people are really high on this one, but I wasn't blown away. Don't get me wrong, there are some really funny bits, and the whole climax where everything just keeps absurdly ramping up is admittedly hilarious, but I just wasn't wholly taken with it. I don't know what else to say other than I wasn't really blown away by anything, but it's definitely a silly and fun time with some good music, so you can't really go wrong. Look, I wasn't really expecting anything concrete at this point in my research, but to my surprise, the Google search for Paul Martin favorite movie actually yielded clear results. In a piece that derided Martin as one of the most boring people alive, Robert Fulford insists that Martin's pick of Butch Cassidy is indicative of the Prime Minister's dullness. So I'm not sure if it's really an accurate pick for his favorite movie or just an illustration, but whatever, I don't care at this point. After watching the film, I couldn't disagree more. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is about two outlaws in the last days of the Wild West, who must evade the authorities who tirelessly pursue them, which is an adventure that takes them all the way down to Bolivia. It's a great film. Obviously, the performances of Redford and Newman are what carry a lot of the charm. They have great chemistry and banter with one another. But another thing that stood out to me was just how fun the camera work is. You just don't see shots in many movies these days that feel like they're actually trying something with the camera, as a physical tool. The film is a funny, yet at times melancholic ode to a bygone era, and it's super fun. Definitely one of the best of this challenge. This one honestly shocked me. Not so much the film, as it's a pretty typical classic to love, but Stephen Harper, the first Prime Minister that I can really remember existing, is apparently the most cinephile of any Prime Minister to date. Also a fan of TV shows like Breaking Bad and the Canadian Murdoch mysteries, he once attempted to utilize his love for TV and movies on the campaign trail to a less than favorable response.
Something you might not know about me is that I love movies and TV shows.
Having at one time named Raising Arizona, Lost in Translation, and Crimes and Misdemeanors as his favorites, the most up-to-date answer I could find was a classic, Wizard of Oz, which means that Stephen Harper is the only Prime Minister that we have a confirmed 4 favorites for his hypothetical Letterboxd page. As a conservative Prime Minister, it's not particularly surprising that he loves the homey nature of Wizard of Oz, and I have to admit, I was pretty taken with it as well. Add that to the fact that the visuals and set design on this thing are still impressive feats in the year 2025, it's hard to dislike. The songs are catchy, all the performances are just genuine and engaging, and it's also a little surprisingly dark at times. It's The Wizard of Oz. I mean, we should all know it by now, and I'm glad to have finally marked this one off as watched.
She has 2 arms to hold me and 4 legs to...
This should come as no shock to anyone, but Justin Trudeau is a huge nerd. Not only are his favorite movies the Star Wars franchise, but in 2015 he actually went on record with his rankings of the first 6 movies. A fellow prequel hater is always great to see. Empire Strikes Back, if you're unfamiliar, somehow, follows Luke Skywalker as he undergoes Jedi training in order to confront Darth Vader, while Han and Leia do their best to annoy each other while evading the Empire. Along with Justin and many other people, I think it is the best Star Wars film, and though I was never like a huge Star Wars kid like he is, every time I watch this installment in particular, I am struck by the sheer impressiveness of the filmmaking. I'm never all that wowed with any Star Wars story itself, but this one just looks fantastic, and it moves along well enough that I don't really care about all those little story details. It's fun, it's stunning, and it's just a great time. I honestly just wish that Carrie Fisher was given a little bit more to do in this one than just kiss her co-stars. While as a young child, he actually ranked Return of the Jedi above it, he has later rescinded this claim and asserted that, yes, Empire Strikes Back is the best one. Which is kind of funny when you think about his dynamic with his dad, Pierre, who, as I have inferred, may have preferred the wholesome father-son reconciliation at the end of Return of the Jedi. It's a cute little thing to think about, and it makes you wonder if Justin ever told his dad that he actually likes Empire better now. Our current Prime Minister, and perhaps not for much longer, I didn't expect much here, as Carney honestly seems like a pretty bland economics type bro, but I was surprised to find that in one podcast episode, he explicitly names Peter Weir's Gallipoli as his favorite. It's an Australian film starring a young Mel Gibson who plays a sprinter who becomes close friends with another young runner before they enlist in the Australian Light Horse Division and join the Allied campaign at Gallipoli in Turkey. For the first 2/3 of the film, it's a pretty meandering and uneventful buddy movie as the 2 leads spend most of their time just trying to enlist, and it even seems a bit lighthearted for what I expected to be a serious war movie. It takes until the 3rd act for them to even get out of Australia. The film starts to change in tone in the last 20 minutes as a pretty unsubtle illustration of the loss of innocence, which is a pretty common motif in a lot of World War I films. And because of the laid-back attitude of the rest of the film, it does lead to a pretty effectively emotional ending. Overall, I wasn't totally taken with it. There are some kind of weird music choices, and none of the characters are particularly memorable, but it's not a bad watch by any means. I certainly appreciate its simpler and more narrow approach to the conflict, and that it doesn't try to be some grand, all-encompassing war movie like others tend to be. Because of course we could have a new Prime Minister very soon, I figured I'd see if I could find the favorites of the other current party leaders of the other major parties in Canada. Bring it back with no time. I'm assuming Elizabeth May, longtime Green leader, is referring to the Warren Beatty Heaven Can Wait as it's the most popular. It sees Beatty as up-and-coming quarterback Joe Pendleton, primed to start the Super Bowl for the Rams, before he's prematurely taken to heaven due to a divine misunderstanding, and to correct this, as his body has already been cremated, he is placed in the body of a not-so-loved wealthy business mogul, in whose body Joe must try to fulfill his dream. I had honestly no expectations going into this, and I was actually blown away. Thanks mostly to a just fabulous himbo performance from Beatty and some really stellar writing from Elaine May, this was altogether a blast. It's hilarious, it's a little touching, and it's a breeze to enjoy. It's a pretty simple film on the surface, but the decisions made in its filmmaking are truly brilliant to create the final product. Definitely one of the best of this challenge so far. Newly named co-leader of the Green Party alongside May, Pedno is actually a filmmaker himself, which is kind of cool, and he named Hotel Rwanda as a formative movie for him in his teenage years, and I can certainly see why. The film is pretty powerful. Obviously, the story is hard to fully communicate in one fictionalized movie, but mainly through a great Don Cheadle performance, it succeeds in giving a glimpse of the atrocities of the Rwandan genocide. Unfortunately, it does feel a bit Hollywoodified and sanitized at times, and some other more lackluster performances don't really help. Overall, though, it's a solid pick from the Green co-leader, and I'd actually be pretty interested in looking at some of the documentaries that he has worked on. Another guy who seems to love his movies, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, once said that he could watch Waterworld 1,000,000 times. I can get that. Waterworld, as has been described before by other people, is basically Mad Max but wet. On an Earth that has been flooded completely, Kevin Costner drifts around blowing shit up, saving helpless women, and looking really annoyed doing it. The film does have some honestly really astounding set pieces and is pretty fun overall, but between Costner taking things really seriously and Dennis Hopper on the other side hamming it up, it feels a bit muddled tonally, and it's not even as rapid paced as you would want a big bombastic action movie to be. Then again, if I'd seen it as a teenager, I probably would have loved it, so I get the hype from Singh. I had to translate a French article for this answer, but the fiery leader of the Bloc Québécois is unsurprisingly a Villeneuve fan, and he marks Blade Runner 2049 as his favorite of the bunch, citing Zimmer's score as magnificent. Ryan Gosling plays a titular Blade Runner, essentially a cop tasked with hunting down rebel replicants, who are manufactured humans that are meant for grunt work, and along the way he uncovers a deep-seated mystery that may upset the entire system. I was keen to give this one a rewatch because up to this point, the first and only time I'd watched it was on an airplane, which is honestly my bad, but to be honest, I am not huge on it, guys. I'm sorry. Obviously, it looks and sounds incredible, and it has some good performances, but much like its predecessor, I am just not that taken by the story that it's all telling. I do like it. Again, I can hardly criticize most of, the actual filmmaking itself, but in the end, it doesn't really do a whole lot for me. Certainly an understandable favorite, though, and honestly, maybe disappointingly, one of the only technically Canadian films of the bunch. So that's it. Overall, this challenge was pretty fun to complete. I found some hidden gems and checked off one or two classics for myself as well. I do wish there was a bit more documentation on the prime ministers who I couldn't find any films for. So if anyone with a good grasp on Canadian political history is watching and has some confirmed sources for the missing prime ministers, let me know. I had hoped there would be more Canadian films, but as usual, our industry is a little lacking in the publicity department, so let me know if you'd like to see a video on some of my favorite Canadian movies. That's all for this video, everyone. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. I'm trying to put out quality film videos on here regularly, and your support honestly really helps it get done. If you're Canadian, don't forget to vote. I went and did early voting, but if you haven't yet, Election Day is April 28th, and I think it's an important thing to do. Don't forget, eh? Go vote.